Hello everyone, we're back again with another video, but today is not a critique video. I'm actually quite excited for this video because this is highly anticipated, or was highly anticipated for me. Today we are not exactly interviewing someone, we are having someone give a presentation on the channel about causality in statistics, inferential statistics particularly, but really the overall field of statistics. This is from someone by the name of Thomas Matcham from the UK. Tom has a first-class master's degree in mathematics from Imperial College London, and has worked as a data scientist in various capacities for 14 years. He's also founded two businesses focused on the applications of machine learning. He currently works as a contractor in London as well. Now, I've known Thomas for a minute now, since I believe February or March of this year. I've tried to get him to start his own channel up to critique a lot of science papers, but things have gotten in the way of that all the way up until now. But he decided to feature on my channel to talk about the area of statistics and when you can assert causality, if at all, hint hint. And we both thought that it would be very important for the layperson, but also other statisticians, to have this information out there with respect to what Thomas calls, or at least what Thomas is referring to, which is causal inference. So I'll let him take the floor with this one. I'm going to do very little talking, and we're going to jump right into the interview right now. Yes, Tom, welcome to the channel for the first time since we have met. A while back, actually. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
I've actually been looking forward to this. I've tried to get you on before, or really I've actually tried to get you to start your own channel, which hasn't yet happened, but I know that you're quite busy. Um, yeah, basically, from my understanding, I say you, but we are really going to talk about when you can establish cause and effect in the area of statistics and when you cannot, really. And just for context for viewers, Tom has admitted something that I have talked about numerous times on my channel, that being the inferential statistics as a field of science, because it is a field of science, cannot establish causality effectively ever. It might imply causality, of course. That's basically the essence of inferential statistics, is trying to imply, you know, get closer and closer to establishing a causal relationship, ideally, but that doesn't ever happen in the area of inferential statistics, and therefore it makes no claims as a science about causality. So I believe, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've talked about that for quite a long time, but please enlighten us on how this is achieved. The floor is now yours in terms of how to establish a causal relationship when it's appropriate to then therefore use causal terms to represent data.
Sure. So, as a general rule, inferential statistics does not like to talk about causality, precisely as you said, and that is because inferential statistics is about association by and large. Now, with extra technology and structure, you can begin to take the ideas of inferential statistics and start to talk about causality. So an example of this that we're all familiar with is the experiment. So that is the inferential. If you look back in the history of, you know, the foundations of statistics, if you read Fisher and Pearson, they are talking about the experiment as how you go from observations about reality and try to draw conclusions from this. However, there are many scenarios where that falls short. Now, I've put together a little sort of presentation of going right from the basics to a sort of worked example that might help to sort of guide this discussion, if that sounds like a useful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
And one thing that we talked about before we started recording is that the thing that elicited this whole conversation from particularly Tom, actually, is the vegan gains, or was the vegan gains Bark-K reaction that I did, because that's basically focused a lot around R values, R squared, and causality, basically, which are tightly intertwined. So yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That was the thing. I listened with interest to your reaction to that debate, and I felt that it was a useful chance to sort of piggyback off that, to perhaps clear things up, and also provide a little bit of color from the sort of sort of being deep in statistics. I work full time as a sort of a data scientist, mainly focusing on statistics, and to give a little bit of color around that from a statistician's perspective. So I apologize for the plainness of these slides. But hopefully the information will be interesting enough as it is. So Eddie, please stop me at any moment if you have any questions. I'm going to try and keep this as a discussion as well to make it interesting and engaging. But
Right.
okay, so to start off, I think it's useful to go through a number of examples here. So Eddie, we've discussed this example sort of offline or personally, but I think it's a good one to kick off the discussion about causality, because this trips people up, and it even trips up statisticians and data scientists who I've worked with. So let's imagine that we have two variables, X and Y here. It doesn't really matter about what those variables mean, but imagine that we've collected data on these two variables, and when we produce a scatter plot of their data and fit a trend to that data, we see something like this, okay? So a strong, what you describe in statistics as a strong linear relationship. Now, I say to you that I can intervene on the values of X and force the value of X to be 0. I'm being very specific about my language there. I'm intervening on X and I'm forcing it to be 0. The question is, what is your prediction for the value of Y? Or to give you a little clue to the answer, what is the range of predictions for the value of Y, given that I have forced the value of X to be 0?
Right. So whenever you had previously asked me this question, I believe I actually got the answer wrong as well. Because it does, you're right, it actually does trip people up. Most of the time when you see a grid like this, right, a scatter plot, and the line looks to be the case, it looks to be the case that if you trend farther and farther down with X going more and more towards 0, for example, then you would expect Y to correlate with that necessarily. So you would expect it to be 0 as well. In this graph, it sort of looks like it's trending towards +1, right, in terms of Y.
Like that.
But something along those lines is what you would expect. Right.
Right. Now, the issue is, well, the correct answer to start off with is actually the most appropriate answer would be any value between the observed minimum and observed maximum Y. And the reason why this is because we have no idea about the relationship between those two variables. And there are 3 possible scenarios. The first one is that X causes Y. And in that case, it would be the most statistically valid answer. Your answer that you gave, Eddie, would be the most statistically valid answer. Would be to extrapolate out from that trend line and make your forecast as that. Now, it could also be the case that Y could be causing X, in which case it would infer the information from X would be doing nothing for your values of Y. So hence that forecast is the most appropriate answer. The other scenario is that X and Y have a common cause. And so changing the value of X will have no, in both those last 2 causal graphs, or those 2 sort of causal relationships, let's not use the word graph yet, because we'll get into that later on. But in those last 2 scenarios, intervening on the value of X has no effect on the value of Y whatsoever. And so this shows immediately the limitations of inferential statistics. Because inferential statistics is a mathematical tool, and we need some extra machinery, some extra technology to be able to talk about causal relationships outside of that. So really, this is a bit of a cheeky question because the problem's ill-defined. We can't really come up with a conclusion, but if we were absolutely forced, gun to our head, to an answer, the correct answer would be between the maximum and minimum values of Y.
Right. And with that, if I could just interject just for a minute, the last possibility as to why that relationship manifests, the one that has the C affecting X and Y. Previously, when you showed it to me, it was labeled as S to represent spurious, I believe, which is, the reason I'm saying that is because many people, when they were watching my videos, may not have understood what I meant by spurious variable. There's, at least when I learned, as much statistics as I learned, which was it was rudimentary level. I'm not saying that I know as much as you. There's absolutely no way. But there was a distinction that was made between confounding variables and spurious variables. And you can actually correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they had taught them as separate things. Confounding variables were ones that you could actually identify as being confounding variables. Like, you know that you can't control for this, you know that you can't control for that. You can identify things that you cannot control for, and then you label those as confounders. Spurious was taught as being something that you possibly may not know to even be a potential confounder in the first place. So they're unaccounted for fully.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not language that I use on a day-to-day basis because you, in sort of the work that I'm trying to do, I'm always thinking about the confounders rather than the spurious effects. But yeah, I think that seems totally valid.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is a bit more wordy, but I was trying to find examples that would be specific for your audience. This is the best that I could come up with, or something that at least not the best. I thought it was the most interesting one. I have some more examples later on, which aren't specific to sort of biochemistry or the sort of carnivore diet per se. But I thought this was still a useful one to think about. So let's imagine that the British Medical Journal decide to do a study on the effect of cholesterol consumption or reduction, dietary cholesterol reduction on atherosclerosis or heart disease. And they hypothesized that by reducing dietary cholesterol, that they're going to see some reduction in the risk of heart disease. So they decide to run a randomized trial where they have two groups, and approximately 50% of participants are assigned to the control group. The other subset are assigned to the intervention. So they're put on a diet low in cholesterol. So this is called a randomized trial. And it's one of the sort of classical ways that statisticians or epidemiologists would attempt to study the effect of one variable on another. And the idea, going back to the history of statistics, would be that the randomization of your assignment should protect against confounding factors, because there should be no correlation between your assignment group and other covariates that may actually have an influence on the outcome of this trial. Right. So that on average, the keyword being on average here, that you're going to have equal values of those confounding variables for each of your groups. Okay, so let's imagine that there is an association found between dietary cholesterol and heart disease. Can the researcher conclude that the dietary intervention actually had a causal impact on lowering heart disease? And the answer is no, they absolutely cannot. And the reason is because there are many possible causal mechanisms that could explain that result. And this is by no means exhaustive, but here's a sort of a subset of ones that, I would say that two of these are probably plausible and two of them aren't. So the first one is obviously the one that the researcher is probably most interested in, that cholesterol directly has a causal impact on heart disease. However, competing causal graphs, and these are very simple sort of causal graphs, would be that the cholesterol intervention, by virtue of the fact that the diet is disgusting or is highly unpalatable, causes significant weight loss, and that has some impact on lowering blood pressure. And it's something that we've discussed in the past, Eddie. I think we are both believers, if that is a strong word, in a sort of theological sense, as you like to say, that blood pressure is a causal factor in heart disease. So that is a perfectly plausible causal diagram that is commensurate with this particular data. Another one could be that maybe cholesterol, this intervention reduces, you can even swap these around. Maybe that's plausible, that there's something going on with this diet that lowers your blood pressure, which then causes weight loss, and then that reduces your risk of heart disease. I wouldn't say that's the most likely, but it's totally plausible, and you need to be able to design another intervention to rule out that possibility. And then finally, maybe you could say that there's a reduction in inflammatory compounds. Maybe you're isolating something that is likely to be highly allergenic in the population that's studied, or something like that. So it's a very, very complicated thing. Point being that the study says nothing about any of these causal graphs. And that is the reason why I think it's really important to think in a causal manner about studies, and to be skeptical of any results that you see in any papers, because from my experience, the people doing this research are not necessarily thinking about their results in a very specific causal way with the language of causal inference behind it. and using their resources to design the best possible study to really get to the bottom of the causal relationship between the variables that they're interested in.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. Not only that, I mean, that brings up a lot of things in my mind. First of all, since scientists are usually not in the business nowadays of doing that, they don't actually do that. Basically the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that scientists nowadays, they seem to basically think that the entire idea behind their job, the whole goal, is to try and desperately prove their hypothesis to be true, as opposed to the
Right.
exact opposite.
Precisely. Yeah.
The job of a scientist, I mean, being a scientist and thinking scientifically in the first place, even if you're not a scientist, requires an extreme amount of humility. You have to put
Yes.
aside your preconceived notions, your beliefs, and you have to try desperately to disprove your hypothesis.
Yes.
And
Yes. Absolutely.
that's also why I tell people most of the time in my videos, I say, don't read the conclusion of a study, because first of all, it may or may not be correct in the first place, but also it, like, just innocently may not be correct or may be correct. But with malice aforethought, a lot of times they purposely put their own ideology in the conclusions of the studies.
Right.
And even before that, sometimes that's what leads them to adjust for data in certain ways with multivariate regression and get the result that they want by inflating the power of it.
Right.
So that's one thing that it brought up to me. This most scientists don't think this way, not because they even can't, but because they decide against it.
Right.
Yeah. So
There's all sorts of inconvenient truths about the funding and structure of research, and there are all sorts of perverse incentives to doing certain research, which I won't get into too much here. I think it's a very interesting topic for another time. But
yeah.
I totally agree with your conclusion that most of the interesting parts of the paper are not in the conclusion. It is going
Right.
through the method, because the papers are the writers of scientific research are fully aware of the fact that people want to go to read the abstract, read the conclusions, and then walk away. And especially in this sort of very polarized sort of scientific environment, where it's almost like a mudslinging match of who can throw as many sort of papers at each other to back up precisely what they're saying. You really have to go into detail to understand what people are claiming and how those papers are being used.
That's exactly what I talk about in my vid. That was actually a really good analogy. Basically just throwing up a bunch of papers,
Right.
and whoever has the most of them,
Yeah.
they win.
Yeah.
That's what seems to be the health space environment on the internet today. So yeah.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Okay. So the takeaway from this so far is, firstly, inferential statistics alone has nothing to say about causality. It doesn't want to. As a subject, statisticians do not want to say things about causality in general. And so I would say that this actually probably hindered the progress of causal inference, because right from the very off, the founders of inferential statistics didn't want to do that, and actually probably pushed the subject too far in the wrong way, in being very strict about talking about associations. But what we will see, and what we have seen, is that with the extra structure, you can start to reason about causality in a rigorous manner. And what we'll see is how you go from these diagrams that we're seeing, and how we can transfer that over into rigorous probabilistic language and reason in a probabilistic manner. So the experimental design is the primary tool of the statistician, but this has problems, and we've seen these multiple causal structures. And also, another thing that I haven't highlighted here is that there may be multiple hidden hypotheses behind which go along with the sort of the stated hypotheses. One of the main ones being that your data actually follows the distribution that is appropriate for the test that you are proposing to use to identify differences between your control and intervention. And there's a whole host of other hidden hypotheses that go along with them, which weaken the strength of doing experimental work by and large, and means that you have to be very, very precise and accurate in your work to make sure that you can draw valid conclusions. But the causal analyst, sort of as opposed to the sort of inferential statistician, has a different primary tool, and we've already alluded to what that is, and we're going to go into more detail about what that is. I've tried to keep this as unmathematical as possible, but as such, I'm going to have to do a bit of hand waving at times, but I'm going to try and give a really good balance between getting a feel for how to do causal inference in reality without going into the mathematical details. So we'll see if I strike a balance. Okay, so the science of causality. There are multiple different approaches to studying causality. We're going to focus on one. I just want to briefly mention that you might hear in certain types of statistical analysis the term Granger causality discussed. That's really used in econometrics, which is sort of the statistical study of economics. We're going to focus on something called Judea-Pearl's do calculus. So Judea-Pearl in the 1980s was really the, just depending on your point of view, the discoverer or the inventor of causal inference as we practice it today. And all of his work really put the foundations, the rigorous foundations of causal inference onto the map. And he's been working like a dog to try and get it accepted as something which is part of our toolbox. And there is still a lot of controversy around the validity of causal inference and a lot of pushback, which is interesting because I think he makes some very reasonable arguments. And it's interesting because the tide is turning in that respect. You will definitely see more people talking about causal inference now than ever before. When I learned this stuff for the first time, there was barely anyone talking about this sort of stuff. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago. That has changed quite a lot in that time. Just as a tiny side note that I'll touch on, we're not interested in sort of a philosophical discussion here of what causality really means or the metaphysics of causality. We're thinking about this from the technical word would be from epistemological perspective. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but we're talking about actually putting these things into practice of what we can learn about causality. I'm not actually talking about what causality is here. So moving on. Now this is one thing that I just wanted to, before we get into the meat, this is one thing that I just wanted to clear up because I felt that there was a little bit of confusion about R-squared values and Pearson's correlation coefficient in the discussion between your reaction to Bart and Vegan Gains discussion and some of the things that Bart was saying as well. So I think it's pretty unequivocal that R-squared values really don't help to create any useful information about causality, and in both directions. So for starters, if we consider the case where R-squared equals 1, i.e. what R-squared, so as a little bit of background, this R-squared is talking about the correlation between or the variance in data or two variables, or the accountable variance in one data which is explained by another variable. It's not talking about causation here. It's merely in terms of correlation between two things. And it's very easy to construct examples that show that two variables can be perfectly correlated, so they can have an R value of 1 and then not be a causal relationship. So if we were to simply construct a variable y, which is equal to 3 times x plus 10, where x is some other real valued variable, and z, which is equal to 2 times x plus some constant 20, then if you were to just plot this data, there is going to be a perfect correlation between those two things. There is you can perfectly express what the value of with knowledge of x, you can perfectly express what the value of y and x and z is going to be. You'd have perfect correlation, perfect zero variance in that relationship. There is no stochasticity, no randomness, but it's not causal, and that's by construction. And conversely, we can find that we can construct scenarios where you can have causally related variables, but the R-squared value, if you were to say, to compute the R-squared value, would be less than 1. And a simple scenario would be if you were considering rainfall and the level of the riverbank of of the River Rhine or something like that would be the classic one. There is a clear causal relationship between the amount of rainfall and that river level, but it's stochastic. And one could argue that it's only stochastic because of we can't possibly capture all of the data that goes into what affects that, the movement of the sea, the riverbed and all those sorts of things. But from a methodological point of view, there is noise in that relationship. If you are just studying, say, rainfall and river levels, then you can say that there's definitely a causal relationship between the two things, but there's noise underlying it. So I just thought that was something that was worth discussing to sort of hopefully clear up that part of the conversation, because in the heat of the debate, things can maybe get lost in the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, and not only that, I've known this, and I was saying that in the video as well, because I discussed this with you 2 days before today, because I wanted to make sure that I got everything right. I use an example of this often, where people often want to say that statins lower your risk of heart disease, and you start talking about R-squared values with the relationship between statin administration, oral administration of statins for over however much of a given period of time, and incidence of heart attacks, usually secondary events, because in order to know that you have heart disease, you have to have a first event to begin with. But I said that theoretically, even if that relationship that were produced exhibited an R-squared value of 1, you have to think, if the statin itself has 2 separate effects that are simultaneously occurring, then you can't necessarily say that the decrease in cholesterol that is associated heavily with statins, because of how we know it operates in our biochemistry in reducing LDL specifically, if it also, which it does, induces anti-inflammatory effects on the body, well, the R-squared value is still 1 in that relationship, because the administration of statins and the decreased incidence of heart attacks, secondary events usually, it's there, but there's 2 effects that are occurring simultaneously from that statin. And so if you want to say that reducing your cholesterol is what the cause of the decreased incidence of secondary events was, and you use the R-squared value that's manifested from such a relationship of 1 to justify that, that's not appropriate. And so it's very similar to what you're saying, if not identical to what you're saying here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the analogy I would use is that talking about R-squared values, or anything like that in this case, is trying to hammer in a nail with a screwdriver. We have a tool which allows us to rigorously talk about these types of things, and it would be the thing that really made me want to have this discussion with you, Eddie, was that I feel that if we can move the conversation even in a tiny way towards people thinking about the correct tools, then that helps, because everyone, even vegan gains in this scenario, he can then start to think about the problems with the correct language, and we can start to all discuss things using the correct tools. As a very, very brief side note as well, when discussing things like statins, the more appropriate statistical analysis that would be called a survival analysis, which is time. It's precisely what you imagine it is. It's time to survival. So if a researcher was looking at LDL cholesterol levels and statin levels and doing some sort of regression type analysis on that, who cares? Honestly, who cares? Because the thing that we really care about is that you have less heart disease, or that you live longer, or stuff like that, right? So don't let people pull the wool over your eyes by inappropriate analysis, because it actually probably happens more than you would anticipate. All right. So moving on very briefly to the language of causal inference. So we've sort of set the stage a little bit with some motivating examples. Now let's try and give a very high level overview of what causal inference is really all about. And the key to causal inference is that it's really a translation device. This is I will give you a link, Eddie, as well, to the book where I got this precise definition from, because it's a good book on causal inference in biology. but I think this was a really, really, really good description of it. Causal inference is a translation device from the language of causality to rigorous probabilistic statements. Really, statistics is based on probability, and what causal inference allows us to do is to take these quite intuitive diagrams and translate those into rigorous probabilistic statements about our problem. And that's really useful because probability theory is very well understood, and is a very well developed theory, which produces quantified results. And that's incredibly powerful for what we're interested in, which is, finding out the truth. That's really what we're here for. I know you and I certainly have our opinions about what the correct way to be eating is. The question is, are we actually learning anything from the current nutritional studies that are available for us to read? Now, so yes, the intermediary of our our causal ideas is the directed graph, and I've been using those in an informal sense, but it's precisely what you would imagine it is. It's that the graph is a intuitive representation or an expression of causal relationships between variables. So in this little graph that I've been using, this structure, the arrows imply that X causes Y and X causes Z in this particular scenario. Now, there are far more complicated examples of this, and there are some specifics. There's some more language around the types of structures that can be produced in a causal graph. But I'm going to skip over that for the sake of brevity and to get a little bit further along. But the thing we're going to lose from that is a little bit of detail. So if there's demand for more detail in this, we can go into more detail, but there's plenty of good resources out there, books on causal inference. I would particularly recommend a book called The Book of Why, which is written by Judea Pearl, and is meant to be a sort of a very gentle introduction into causal inference, for more details or sort of a gateway into the mathematics of this sort of stuff. But the one mathematical concept I do want to discuss very, very briefly is a concept called deseparation, because deseparation is pivotal for the translation of causal statements to probabilistic statements. So we talked about this sort of mapping from our causal intuition onto a directed graph onto rigorous probability statements. Deseparation is a tool, and I will give a little bit of information about deseparation, but as little as possible. Deseparation is the thing that allows us to make causal statements from these graphs, and in particular, the primary tool, probabilistic tool, is this notion of dependence and independence. So we all know what this is intuitively. If I'm flipping two coins, then the number, say for example, I flip two coins 6 times, then the number of heads that I get on one coin is independent from the number of heads that I get on the other coin. There's no relationship between those things. So we're starting to see immediately why dependence and independence is a way of translating this idea of causality into the world of probability. But deseparation is kind of like a generalization of that idea, given that we don't just have two variables, we may have lots of variables which have complicated relationships with each other. So at a high level, deseparation allows us to block causal information from sets of variables, and that allows us to isolate the relationship between vertices of interest. So that's what it is. It's mathematical language or a mathematical tool that allows us to say, hey, if we can block off the influence of certain variables, then we can speak in very precise terms about the relationship between two things. So as a very, very simple example here, and I'm going to use this term block in a very non-specific, hand-wavy kind of way, but we can maybe imagine what we're talking about. If we take this little causal graph here, if I was to block off the relationship, block off X in this diagram, in some way, some hand-wavy way, that would make Y and Z independent of each other. Because what I've done is I've blocked off any way that information could be passing between those two variables from each other. And so that's what deseparation is really all about. It's a way of blocking off information so that we can say, are Y and Z still independent of each other? Okay. Is that clear, Eddie?
Yeah, that's absolutely clear. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Okay. So this I think it's useful to to discuss a little bit of how we actually use causal inference for the purposes of deductive reasoning. And so, what I really should do is preface this with how we do it in inferential statistics, but I hope it will be clear just from this of the way that you use causal reasoning, because it's very intuitive as well. So we start with a number of assumptions. If the data were generated according to a particular causal model that we are presupposing is the correct causal model for a problem, if the causal process generating the data does not include linear feedback relationships, i.e., non-linear feedback relationships, i.e., it's a well-defined graph. If the statistical test used to test the independence relationships is appropriate for the data, we discussed this previously, using the correct tests, because frequently, I would argue that they're not done. If rare sampling fluctuation did not occur, so that's just basically saying that you can sometimes get correlations between covariates of your randomly assigned data just by bad luck. So that can happen sometimes. You have to rule that out. Then each deseparation statement will be mirrored by a probabilistic independence in the data. So basically, the importance of that is that basically that's our tool from translating causal statements into probabilistic statements. Now, our causal model will make predictions about probabilistic independence and dependence of variables. And if that's a bit unclear, I think an example that I'll go through in a moment will make this more clear. But it will make predictions about the state of the world, about what we'd expect to see from our data. If it turns out that we can find dependencies in our data, given that we've deseparated sufficiently, then we can it implies that the causal model is wrong. And this is precisely what you'd expect in line with what you were saying earlier about falsification, Eddie. So it's how the idea of falsification is applied to causal inference. We start with some assumptions. We rule out everything else that could possibly muddy the water. We make predictions about the world. If our predictions are invalidated, therefore the causal model is incorrect. All right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So to make this even more concrete, here's what we do. We transcribe a causal hypothesis into a causal graph, showing how each variable is causally linked to other variables in the form of indirect and direct effects. We then use deseparation to predict what types of probabilistic relationships we would expect to see in the data. And then thirdly, we test that the observed data conforms with the predictions of the model. And that way, if it does, then we are providing confirmatory evidence. Well, we're not providing confirmatory evidence, because what we're doing is we say that we have failed to falsify our model. We then go to make other predictions and see if they conform with the model, and that's how science continues. We're always attempting to falsify our hypothesis of the world, and then whatever stands, that's what we say. Well, that's the best guess we've got. Well, not guess, but that's the best model we've got. Okay, so to finish off our discussion, I thought it would be useful to go through a worked example. Now, I would really like to go through something to do with biomedicine, biochemistry, but this was the best example I could find that was well thought out. It was kind of biological, so Eddie, apologies if I mispronounce anything, or I butcher the biochemistry here or the chemistry here, but I'm going to try my best because I'm not well versed in this area at all. So the scenario that we're going to go through is that we have a researcher who wants to determine if and how nitrate fertilizer can increase the yield of a crop. So in this case, it's alfalfa, which I believe is an American pronunciation for something. I don't know what it is. Do you know what it is, Eddie?
I actually don't. I don't know. I've heard it so often, but do I actually know specifically what alfalfa is? No, I don't. And I'll probably be laughed at for that. It's really ironic that I get comments about how I know really technical stuff, but I don't know like basic stuff at the same time. It's
I've got no idea.
Yeah.
I presume it's something that hippies eat. It sounds like sort of sprouted, like sprouted grains. That's what it reminds me of. But I'm not sure if that's right. Okay, so what I've put up on the slide here is what is the correct causal graph that the researcher does not know. So this is assumed for this problem to be, what is it going on? This is the data generating process here. So, and this is actually quite a complicated graph. There's a lot of things going on here. But the main things that we're interested in is that the fertilizer was added to the soil by the farmer, and that added nitrogen to the soil, and that increased the plant yield for this year. But there are a number of sort of other effects that are going on here that make the problem more complicated. First and foremost is that there is bacteria in the roots of the alfalfa that is able to that has an influence on the free nitrogen in the soil and in the air. Well, I think there's also this thing which I've forgotten what it means, NOx deposition. I think that's related to the amount of nitrogen. I don't know what NOx is, but there you go. Now, the other most important thing is that the plant yield for the previous year also had a causal effect on how much fertilizer the farmer put in this scenario. So if there was if there were the parts of his fields or certain fields that had a particularly bad crop, that meant that the farmer put more of the fertilizer on in this sort of hypothetical scenario. So that's why we have in this sort of the ground truth, you could say, has a causal link from the plant yield of last year to the amount of fertilizer that the farmer added in this current year. And the last thing is that the natural levels of phosphate in the soil has an effect on the plant yield, but it also has an effect of the previous year, and it also has an effect on the plant yield of this year. So this is, and there are other causes as well, which are going to be important later on. But that's sort of the problem description. Now, the researcher, as I said, doesn't know what the true causal graph is, but from previous research, he knows about some of these relationships. So he talks to the farmer and he finds out that the farmer changed his level of fertilizers in soil based on the crop yield for last year. So that's what the researcher knows, that there's a causal relationship between those two things. He's also suspicious of the fact that there might be other causes. For example, the slope of the soil is going to affect the drainage, and that might have an effect on the amount of fertilizer in the soil. He also knows from previous research about this bacteria in the roots and the effect that has. And the other thing is that he knows that the fertilizer, the amount of fertilizer used, is associated with the plant yield from this year. So what that means is that he has found that, oh, the farmer put in more fertilizer, and or that there is a linear relationship. Let's say, for assumption, that there is a linear relationship between or associations. What I really should say, there is a linear association between the amount of fertilizer the farmer used and the plant yield for that year. Now, why does that mean that we can't draw causal conclusions from that association? Well, we're going to go through that in a moment, because it turns out that based on this partial knowledge, the researcher cannot draw the conclusion that the fertilizer had a causal effect. And that is because whilst we can rule out that the plant yield from previous years has a causal effect, we can, I used this term blocking earlier on, because this arrow goes in here, and I'm getting into a little bit of technical details here, but you just have to take my word for it. Because this causal arrow points in, that means that we can control for the effects of the plant yield for the previous year. So that means that we can block off information leaking from fertilizer added by the farmer to the plant yield. It turns out that this other causes is actually going to be a bit of a problem. And as an example of that, you could imagine that this could be, we know that it's not, because we've been, spoiled on what the actual true causal graph is, but it's totally reasonable to presume that if there's a hill, that's going to cause the tractor to slow down, which means that the rate of fertilizer per square foot put into the soil is going to be higher. So that's going to increase the amount of fertilizer used. But also a hill may cause something like water accumulation, and that would also affect the plant yield. So this is why thinking in these terms is really important, because a simple analysis would say fertilizer added goes up, plant yield goes up, let's go home. But it actually turns out that there is a leakage of information from fertilizer added to the farmer through this this is called a collider. This particular hill is a collider, and this sneaky collider allows us to invalidate that as the only possible cause. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what the researcher does. He comes to an agreement with the farmer that the farmer won't add any fertilizer himself. So that is basically blocking off. We are controlling for this variable here, the fertilizer added by the farmer, and we are saying that there's no way that causal information could go from fertilizer added by the farmer to nitrogen added to the soil, because we basically said, hey, you're not going to do that, right? I'm, as a researcher, I'm going to be the only person who's going to randomly assign amount of nitrogen added to the soil using some proper randomization technique. So he's either going to set it to 0 or some other value, say 20 kilograms per meter squared or something like that, or square foot, right? And the question is, does this allow the researcher to draw causal conclusions about the effect of nitrogen in the soil, or adding exogenous nitrogen into the soil, about the plant yield? And the answer is yes. And the reason is because there's no other back door where information could get through to the node that we really care about, which is plant yield this year, from our intervention. It's a singular, it's a very precise sort of incision into the causal graph. We are only acting on nitrogen added to the soil. There's no other path for nitrogen added to the soil, our intervention to plant yield, that could confound or could create a spurious correlation between our intervention and the plant yield. So then we can actually say, because we have all this other information about the causal graph, we can say with precision that nitrogen added, if we find an association between the nitrogen we've added and the plant yield, then there is a causal impact of nitrogen to plant yield. Is that making sense, Eddie?
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to ask? I'm pretty much done. So if you have any questions, then please fire them off.
Well, no, I mean, this is something that is incredibly dense for someone, like, even including me. I'm not gonna pretend like this isn't, because, like I said, most of the statistics that I've learned is extremely rudimentary because I've been focusing on other things, which is one of the reasons why I actually wanted you on here on the channel, because you know this stuff far more than I do. The stuff that I know is enough to dispense with basically all of human nutrition science, for the most part. But I'd like to, I mean, the thing that I've talked about a lot is that, people want to assert causality. People want to assert certainty in the world because of, the more cynical viewpoint that I've espoused on the channel is that it's arrogance, pride, hubris, to believe that you can basically assert order in the world at the expense of the truth, and have everything go swell. Because that's kind of, I wrote about this actually yesterday, or maybe the day before that. I have other book ideas, and what happens is I'll be working on something and I'll think things like this, and if I don't get them out, then I'm like really, really, really frustrated if I don't articulate them on paper or something. So I start writing them out, and I've written like pages. That's actually how I wrote my book in the first place. The first one, the one that I have out now. I just was like, I have so much in my head, I got to write it all out, and then I organized it all. But the thing that I talked about was most of what I've seen is a bunch of arrogant, well, scientists and also laymen believing that, they can curtail their own perception of chaos more and more and more to the point of its non-existence by establishing order in the world based on associations, and then trying to, once again, prove the hypothesis instead of disproving it, basically trying to bolster it as much as possible instead of trying to tear it down as much as possible, to steelman it, in other words. And the only thing that I could deduce from it was that it was either conscious with malice aforethought or unconscious arrogance. But it is kind of, in a way, that's a cynical viewpoint, because on the other hand, all humans do that to some degree, every single one of us, because we don't like chaos. We would like to establish order in the world, uh, you know, as much as possible. And if there are a responsible way of doing such a thing, then that's of course what we should be doing. And so with everything that you've put forth, which seems to be at the very least a possible responsible way of doing such a thing, at the very least, I'd like to sit back and absorb all the information after watching it again. That's sort of how I learn the best. I have people tell me everything, and then I absorb however much of a percent of that I can, and then I review it again afterwards. I think that's probably the best for me because this is something that I've actually never learned before. But some of it's stuff that I intuitively understood, and some of it isn't. And I might have questions about it later on, and I'm looking forward to my viewers as well asking questions or giving feedback or giving feedback on this information because this is quite dense for me, just given the fact that it is quite novel for me. You know, so
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a difficult topic to broach because there is new lingo, there's new terminology. It's something which we have great intuition for, causality. We have to in a way to survive, but
Yeah.
the translation into sort of graphs and mathematical terms is tricky. It took me a long time to get my head around it myself. I think the most important thing that I could add at the end of this conversation is that this worked example is very idealistic. And the reason why it's idealistic, sorry, is that the correct word? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's because in the real world, we do not have certainty about the causal graph. We cannot, we frequently cannot rule out that there are backdoors. There are other information that is causing spurious relationships between what we're interested in. So whilst I think that this field is incredibly useful, I don't actually use it a great deal on a day-to-day basis. But what I do use it for is to organize my thoughts. It's almost like a
Mm-hmm.
way of I use it in almost like in as a tool for invalidation of certain ideas. To sort of say, okay, have I thought about all the components? So
Right.
something that I haven't done here, but I think might be useful another day, is to discuss the causality of cholesterol again and the cholesterol hypothesis, because I think when it's broached in the terms of sort of these causal diagrams, I think the whole thing falls to pieces, because I think there's a much stronger causal graph for hemodynamics being the primary effector and blood pressure being the primary effector of atherosclerosis and the build-up of plaque than the cholesterol hypothesis. And I use that framework to help me think about those things rather than thinking, oh, okay, now well I can take some data from some observational trial, an observational study, excuse me, and then I can put it through I can apply the toolbox to it, and I can say, oh, this suits this causal model better. Because you get far enough just by saying, okay, this theory makes predictions, whereas the cholesterol hypothesis doesn't. This theory explains a lot more than the cholesterol hypothesis does. So I just wanted this to be an introduction. I totally get where you're coming from, Eddie, that it's dense.
Mm-hmm.
But if you or your audience have more questions or would like to do a follow-up, I'll be more than happy to.
All right, yeah, sounds good. Thank you for giving this presentation here. I mean, I know that you said that it might have been a little, might have come across as a little bleak and plain, but it probably still took quite a bit of work to organize the thoughts into bullet points. So, I mean, and even if it didn't, I mean, the fact that you did it out of consideration for the channel is something that is appreciated. So, hopefully we have you back on the channel soon, and hopefully you start up your own channel debunking these scientific papers. I've bugged you about it for a while, but you know, especially you can start off with that Mendelian randomization one that's often cited, or the European Atherosclerotic Society consensus panel that said the LDL is causal, and yeah.
That's a bad one. I hope someone doesn't see this and hears me slagging off all of these terrible papers and thinks that, you know, I don't know, doesn't give me a job. But yeah, that was particularly egregious. You know,
Right.
you know you're in trouble when, as scientists, you're appealing to consensus. Yeah, that was bad. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, we will hopefully see you soon once again, and I will let everyone know how to get in contact with you with respect to any questions that they might have if they want to ask you directly, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. People can fire off an email. Maybe I'll set up a Twitter account or something like that as well. You know, if there's enough demand. I doubt there will be, but it's always an option if people are dying to ask me something.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. All right. Well,
Thanks very much, Eddie. Cheers.
no problem. Thanks for coming on the channel.
No worries.